Hey there, I'm Jim
And I'm Matt.
I'm Dusty,
from Dad's Doing Nerd Shit.
a podcast on the Fandom Limb Media Network.
We talk about all kinds of nerdy stuff.
From Dungeons and Dragons to the MCU.
From video games to semi-current space news.
And anything else that catches our attention.
New episodes go live every Monday morning on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
We can also be found on Facebook, Instagram, and the Twitter.
So roll the dice and join us as we discuss the things we love and the culture around being a nerd.
Hello everyone, Screenplay Archaeology host KiramidHead here. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to get some intro stuff out of the way. First things first, we are now part of the Fandom Limb Media Podcast Network, so I'm going to link their site down below. And that's why you would have just heard a promo for another podcast, because they're another one of the shows on the network. And as per usual, if you like the show and you'd like to know more, you can check out our social media pages on Facebook, Tumblr, Twitter, and even Instagram now. The show also has a Patreon if you're willing to gift money, but you don't really need to if you don't want to. And we also have a Discord server, which you can join if you want to chat with, the group members there. So that link is going to be down below as well. So yeah, sit back, guys, and enjoy the show. All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Screenplay Archaeology podcast. I'm your host, KiramidHead. And to begin with, I would like to apologize for taking so long to get this one out. I haven't put an episode out since late July because I got distracted by the whole Powerpuff Girls thing I did with hot quality content, which no complaints there. That was very fun and very cool, and they got a ton of views on their channel, so that's good. But I kind of considered that my episode for August and was probably a bad idea because I just wasn't even thinking about episodes. I was just kind of drifting a little in and out. And then midway through September, I finally started thinking about doing one. And this is a script which I've read a couple times before. And so I finally picked one out. And then days after that, I went out of town for 4 days and I had a hard time getting back into it when I got back home. And so here we are recording this early October, but it all works out because it's a horror script. Now, what we're going to be taking a look at tonight is a script called Adrift, written by Steven Susko, who's probably best known for writing the first two American Grudge movies. And interestingly enough, it's based on a short story by Koji Suzuki, whom you may not know his name, but you may be familiar with variations of his work. He was the original writer of the story of The Ring in a series of novels. So it's an interesting mix here. Now, the plot of this script, just to give you a little snippet going forward, it starts off with crew members on an Alaskan crab fishing boat in the Bering Sea. They're coming home from a big haul, and they've come across this luxury yacht that's just been left adrift, frozen in an ice floe. And things aren't quite right. There's kind of weird things going on, but they decide that they're going to, remove it from the ice and try and haul it back to claim salvage rights on the boat. And a boat that expensive would net them quite a bit of money, even after taxes. And two of them elect to stay on the yacht in case anything goes wrong. But within a day, the first night on there, the next morning they wake up and the lines have been cut and they have been left adrift, and there are supernatural forces at play upon this yacht. And I am very proud of doing that off the cuff. But so before I get into the script itself, I just kind of want to get into some background on the people involved. Koji Suzuki is quite a good writer. He's known as the Japanese Stephen King, and that's a little bit of a misnomer. I feel like that just kind of happened because, he's a well-known Japanese horror writer, probably the best known one in the West. And that's why he kind of got lumped in with Stephen King. But his work is quite a bit different from King's. The tone is often quite different. And he does a wide range of subject matter. He doesn't just do horror. Then again, neither does Stephen King. But Koji Suzuki's horror is more often than not tinged with science fiction, among other things. And, I won't get into anything for fear of spoilers for anyone who wants to read his books. But I really like the Ring trilogy as it was when I read it. It was a trilogy of novels, and a collection of short stories that built on that trilogy of novels. And that was it for years. And then years later, he wrote 2 more books, only one of which has been translated into English, one of which was very loosely the basis for that shit-awful Sadako 3D movie. But from what I understand, it was a very, very loose adaptation, aside from like a couple character names. But no, I do quite like his books. I've read those Ring books, and I've read his short story collection, Dark Water, which is a series of short stories which are linked by the theme of water. Some of them are horror stories, some of them aren't. There's some that have supernatural aspects. There's at least one that doesn't. There's one about a play, which is just weird, but it's a good short story collection. Two of which have been adapted to film, actually. You have the first story, Floating Water, got adapted to film twice under the collection's title Dark Water, once by Hideo Nakata, who did the Japanese Ring, and it got adapted into an American film of Jennifer Connelly, which I think is a bit of an underrated horror film. It's not like a lost gem or anything, but it's actually a pretty good movie, and the Japanese version is very good as well. And also there's a story called Dream Cruise, which got adapted into a Masters of Horror episode directed by Norio Tsuruda, who was the director of a Ring movie, Ring Zero Birthday, which is the best movie in that series after the original. It's honestly one of the best prequels I've ever seen. I haven't watched the Masters of Horror episode of Dream Cruise, but just based on things I've heard, stuff I've read on the Wikipedia page about the plot, it sounds like it barely has anything to do with the short story, and they added all this like torture porn subplots to it, and like crazy dude trying to kill them, and then there's a ghost, but it's not the ghost from the script. I'm so used to talking about scripts from the short story. It sounds like a mess and just not very good. And apparently they shot it as a movie and then edited it down to like an hour for the episode. I'm like, that's weird. But yeah, so that's interesting. And the story we're going to talk about now, Adrift, it's interesting that they mentioned that this is a script I came across, because on the back cover of the English translation that I have right here, it says that this is currently in production with Dimension Films. And as far as I know, this never got into production. It has been adapted a couple other times. It was adapted into a manga, which adapted a few different stories from the Dark Water collection. And I found it online just to read it, and it was honestly really disappointing. Like, it barely had anything at all to do with the story. It was just 1 or 2 ideas from it, and it seemed like it was just an excuse for the artist to draw women in bikinis. Like, it had nothing to do with the short story aside from one little thing. Like, what the hell was that? So this script already has the edge up after reading that. And apparently this was also partly the basis for Open Water 2, or the movie Adrift that got titled Open Water 2 Adrift for marketing purposes. And I read a little bit of the Wikipedia synopsis of that movie, and I don't really see the similarity at all. I would love to know what the backstory is behind that, because that is just one of the weirdest fucking things I have ever heard. Because I just was reading about it. I was just trying to find information about this attempt, and suddenly I'm finding, what? It was adapted as Open Water 2? And that movie is apparently about people on a yacht who decide to go swim in the ocean, and like a bunch of dumbasses, they don't lower the ladder so they can't get back on the yacht, which is not the plot of this story. But yeah, I think the short story Adrift, I can see why someone looked at that and went, wow, let's try and make a horror movie out of this, because it's a great little premise. There's just enough there for a hook for expanding the story. And it has some really creepy atmosphere, one particular piece of imagery which is used in this, and like some decent character development for the main character, which is used a bit in this, but they kind of change it around. And so, I mean, it's a good, creepy little short story with a nice little twist at the end, and it has like a supernatural menace that isn't fully explained, but it's kind of satisfying without being explained, which is a hard thing to talk about. So I'm going to get into this script. Now, before I want to mention Steven Susko. I looked at his filmography. I don't like the first American Grudge at all, but I don't really blame him. I feel like that was just the nature of the assignment, was here. Take like the best bits of all 4 Japanese Grudge movies that existed at the time, mush them into one plot, make it a little bit more linear, and kind of water it down for the US audience. And it's a movie I don't really care for, because it's just like, oh, it's those movies mashed together, only worse. Now, he also wrote Grudge 2, which I am on a hill by myself with this one, but I thought that was actually okay, and I liked it much better than the first. Now, granted, I saw the director's cut, which apparently reinstated certain things, which made the plot more coherent, but that had a few clever twists in it, and it did the non-linear anthology-style storytelling of Ju-on much better than the first American Grudge did, in my opinion. And looking at his stuff, he did a movie called Red, which I've heard of, where it's like Brian Cox's dog gets killed by teenagers and he goes after the teenagers. I've heard that movie's actually really, really good, and I've never actually gotten around to seeing it. There's a couple things in there I hadn't heard of. He has a story credit on Texas Chainsaw 3D, of all things. But I actually have the script he wrote that got him the story credit, and aside from like a few faint similarities, it's a very different story, and everything you hate about that movie, like the dumb timeline, the stupid character actions at the end, none of that was in there. It was interesting, but it was written as part 1 of 3, and parts 2 and 3 were never written, so you basically get 1/3 of a story that's okay, and would have been one of the better Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies because it was different, but not going completely out of its mind crazy bananas like those movies tend to go. And he had a story credit on Hellfest, which I thought was pretty decent. It wasn't like an all-time classic slasher movie. It's been kind of forgotten and not necessarily unfairly so, but I thought it was pretty entertaining for what it was. But I don't know what he wrote on that, and that movie has like 6 credited writers. It's something ridiculous. And he wrote and directed Unfriended Dark Web, which is a movie which you either like it because it's different from the first movie, which you hated, or you love the first movie, so you hate the sequel because it's very different. Those seem to be the reactions I've been seeing to it. But he has a few projects that are kind of like upcoming. Nothing really stood out to me. So he's a writer I kind of have a mixed reception with. Like, I don't like Grudge 1, but I like Grudge 2. His Leatherface script was pretty good. And whatever his contributions to Hellfest were, maybe they were good. Maybe his version was better. I don't know. So he's not a writer I'm fully have like any sort of set opinion on. He can be good, he can be bad. You know, it's an up and down kind of thing. Now, to get into the script, it keeps the title Adrift, and it's a first draft dated June 24th, 2005. And that date's going to be important when I talk about the setup for this thing. So it opens on the Bering Sea with Inuit fisherman Arnoluk, or Arnie for short, standing on the deck of the crab fishing boat North Star, staring out at the ocean. Also on deck is Eric, the ship's all-around asshole, who's just here to provide a certain amount of tension early on and to be an asshole and set up one scene later on, and that's kind of it. He's repairing the leg on the boat's sorting table. He has a fresh cut on his face. And he seems to not like Arnie for reasons that aren't clear. Like, there seems to be some racism there, but then it's like he thinks he's creepy. Like, he just seems to be really dismissive of this guy who's on the same ship as him and part of his crew for no real reason other than that he doesn't like the Inuit guy. And so in the wheelhouse, Captain Johan is at the wheel, while old crew members Vic and Jerry are playing Scrabble, which they've been doing for a while, and they have like their scores tallied up, and they're ridiculously high. Now, we spend quite a bit of time at the beginning of this setting up these characters, and most of them are not in the majority of this, so it kind of feels weird how much time we spend on these characters who don't matter all that much in the long run. And so Eric enters and has to assure Johan that the table will hold long enough for them to finish the run and get back to port, which seems to annoy him. And he also dodges the captain's question about the cut on his face before the captain blasts the air horn and tells him to go make sure the greenhorn heard that. And so Eric routes Lucas, who is the greenhorn, out of bed and is particularly harsh with him. And on his way out of the crew's quarters, Eric runs into female crew member Chris. And she starts reaching for something in her pocket, but Lucas stumbles out and Eric backs off, with Chris shutting herself inside the crew quarters when Lucas tries to talk to her. So yeah, there's some tension between those two, which gets explained later on. Between her and Eric, and there's different things that happen, but her and Lucas kind of form a bond as it goes on, sort of. And so Lucas emerges onto the deck and goes to talk to Arnie, who apparently is the only person Arnie will talk to. That's not really established very well. He's still staring at the sea and twiddling something on the end of a leather necklace he's wearing, and he manages to get Arnie to look at him, and there's a hint of fear in his eyes. And we see Jerry retrieve a canvas bag from the boat's ice room, and the crew leaps into action, retrieving the last set of crab pots for the season, bringing in quite the haul, which Johan calculates adds up to just under 10,000 crabs for the whole trip. Now, I want to talk about a difference from the short story here. In there, the main character, Kazuo, was the assistant engineer on like a big commercial fishing, like, if you've seen the Roland Emmerich Godzilla movie, the big ass boat at the beginning of that, that's kind of what I was thinking when I was reading that short story. And here it's more blue collar, Alaskan crab fishing guys. And it's funny about the date because I had to look this up. This is 2 months after the series premiere of Deadliest Catch. And so I can only think that like Susko had his finger on the pulse of the zeitgeist, so he knew that show was doing well and was kind of a big deal. And he went, let's kind of take the story of Adrift and plug it into this. It almost makes me wonder if they were playing like a cross promotion, like these characters here at the beginning, they would have gotten like crew members from Deadliest Catch to play themselves or something like that. It would not surprise me if this was a Dimension project, something weird like that. It wouldn't surprise me if they tried that. And Jerry, saying they have to celebrate, takes out the canvas bag, which contains 8 steaks he cooks up for the occasion, throwing one into the sea as an offering. And Johan, who tells a story about how he stopped drinking after he missed the birth of his first son on account of being drunk, tells Lucas that he's worked harder than any first-timer he's seen and that he has a spot on the boat if he ever wants one again. He also points out that a felt tail has been attached to his coat as a practical joke, to which even the normally stoic Chris gives a quick, sneaky smirk. I don't know what the prank is there. Is it meant to be like a donkey's tail? Like pin the tail on the donkey? And so after dinner, the crew all sits around talking about what they'll do with their shares. Johan wants to take his kids to Disney World. Jerry wants to buy his own yacht and call it the Enterprise F, which is pretty funny. I don't think we've seen an Enterprise F in Star Trek even now. I think the last one they showed chronologically was E, but I haven't watched the Picard series, so I don't know if they do like an Enterprise F in that. Eric, I want to find myself a woman, and so blah, blah, blah. And Chris, who has perched atop the empty crab pots, notices that the stars have begun to disappear. A storm front is moving in. And Johan decides to head north and avoid the worst of it, while Eric insists that having a woman on board was bad luck. Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. Mentioning that something happened to Chris's last crew, but Johan won't hear it. And we then see Arnie on deck looking at the storm and then turning to look north, seemingly more afraid of where they're going. So some decent foreshadowing here, even if we're kind of making out the Inuit guy to be like the magical Native American character of the script, which is a bit of an unfortunate stereotype. And so the crew, minus Johan, who's manning the wheel, they all hole up in the quarters as the boat is rocked by rough seas, which still doesn't stop Jerry and Vic from playing their Scrabble game, even though you think if the boat's getting tossed around, the tiles are going to slide around all over the place and the game's going to get fucked up. I just thought of that. Lucas looks at a blank spot on the wall where something used to be taped up, something he's taken down. We find out what that is later. Arnie, looking awful, staggers out of the room to vomit, and Lucas finally starts to fall asleep, but that's when something changes and the boat is suddenly still. Everyone is freaked out by this, and Jerry notices that his unused Scrabble tiles spell out silence. It's funny, I've now done 2 scripts where Scrabble tiles are used for creepy foreshadowing, Bioshock being the other one. The crew, along with Johan, emerge on the deck in the dark, and Arnie, who supposedly doesn't speak English, asks if they can hear it, and they do, the soft tolling of a bell. Yeah, they say something like, I didn't know you could speak English, and later on in the script, Lucas is like, oh yeah, me and Arnie would talk all the time. I'm like, this is a first draft, so some inconsistencies are to be expected. There's a few I'm going to call out later on, which are very noticeable, but it's something that would probably be fixed with a second or third draft, and that's a theme that's going to be coming up in this episode. I feel like this is an okay first draft that could be something really, really good if like a second or third draft, if it was worked on a little more. And so Vic turns on the flashlight and spots something, and they all kind of see it. And Johan fires off a flare, revealing a 100-foot luxury yacht. Lucas notices it isn't moving, just as the flare seems to land flat on the water, and Johan's like, what? That shouldn't happen. And so he fires another flare at a lower angle, revealing that the yacht has been caught in an ice floe. An object is hanging from the yacht's bell, making it toll when it moves in the wind. Johan uses a pair of binoculars, spotting the name Equinox painted on its side, as well as the US and California flags. Johan attempts to radio the Equinox, and there's no response apart from his own voice being projected from the yacht's radio, apparently turned up to full blast. Vic wants to go over to the yacht and check for people, but Eric and Jerry argue they should just leave it there. Johan tries to call the Coast Guard, but can't get a response, and orders Jerry, Eric, and Arnie to board the yacht with him, and Lucas volunteers to go along as well. However, while Lucas gets ready to board the yacht, Arnie grabs onto his arm and tells him to stay, and the seriousness of the Inuit's expression convinces Lucas to do what he says, and the 4 others board the Equinox without him. Chris comes up on deck later and finds Lucas sitting there sketching the yacht in his journal, which he always has. That's like something that's mentioned a few times in this. And they start to chat, and they speculate that the ice broke off from a floe further north, but even this doesn't explain how the yacht got stuck in it in the first place. And they then hear what sounds like yelling coming from the Equinox and head to the bridge to try to contact the boarding party via radio to no avail. And they then see Johan, Jerry, and Eric dragging Arnie away from the yacht on the ice. And they get him aboard the North Star, where he has one arm clutched to his chest and isn't breathing. And Eric's like, I found him like this below decks. Chris tries to save him by defibrillating him with the boat's AED, but it's all for naught and Arnie dies. They just killed the ethnic guy first, not complaining, just observing. The crew wants to give him a burial at sea, but Lucas talks him out of it by citing Inuit burial practices. And he says something that like their afterlife relies on them having to be reborn from the earth. And I tried to look this up just to double check, and I couldn't find anything about that. I read that there are Inuit tribes who bury their dead, and then there's others, like I think it's in part of Greenland where they like float the body out on a raft or something like that. I didn't see anything about being reborn from the soil, but I mean, I maybe just have gaps in my research. If anyone wants to fill those in, you're welcome to do so in the comments or in an email or something like that. The crew okay, I've already read that. They place him in one of the storage bays and pay their respects and leave one by one. He's in an ice room, essentially. Lucas is the last and finds Arnie's necklace in the hand he clutched to his chest with a glass bottle on the end of it. And I thought that was going to be significant, and the bottle is just there so someone can step on it and make a crunching sound later on. We never hear about about the necklace after this, because Lucas it's like literally like the script is almost over when the necklace comes up again. Lucas takes the necklace and turns on the ice machine, burying him in ice for the journey back to land. And they then gather into quarters with Johan relaying the info he's found about the yacht. It's chartered in San Diego, which makes explaining where they found it even more difficult. The engine won't start for any noticeable reason, and there was a family with 2 kids and a couple crew members on board, including a captain, but they're all missing. The lifeboat is still there, and all of their stuff is intact. Now, this is where there's a bit of a math fuck-up in this script, is because there's 4 family members, a captain, and at least 2 crew members, but multiple times they say there were 6 people on the yacht and they disappeared. That adds up to 7 last I checked. And Eric then asks how much the yacht would be worth, and Vic speculates no less than $10 million. And Eric proposes they claim salvage and make some money, even if they only get to split 20% of that number, which, believe me, would be more than enough. He convinces them by saying that they could use the money to further their personal endeavors, and tells Chris she could buy back her father's boat. And so the reason they tow the boat back here, like I just said, is for salvage rights. In the short story, they come across it drifting in the shipping lane. And they decide to tow it part of the way back to land because they don't want to have to sit around waiting for the Japanese equivalent of the Coast Guard to get all the way out there. So yeah, that's another difference. Johan makes a call to tow in the yacht, and soon enough, they get to work melting the ice around it with blowtorches and lashing it to the back of the North Star. And while they're setting this up, Jerry compares this situation to the story of the Marie Celeste, which is this famous story about a boat that was found drifting and its crew was missing, and it's been built up into this huge mystery over the years. It's essentially like the ocean-going version of an urban legend. And every time like a fictional story tries to talk about it's really the Mary Celeste in reality. They always get all of the details wrong. And if you actually do any reading into this, the circumstances aren't really that mysterious. Like the story is always like, oh, it's like there was no signs of distress. There was food out on the table. No lifeboats are missing. And then you read about the extra reports by the people who found the ship and like, oh, everything was overturned. There was definitely signs of distress and the lifeboat was missing. And it's like, oh, so this is just saying people have sensationalized and embellished over the years, most of which was the work of Arthur Conan Doyle, of all people, who wrote a story about it in the magazine. He's the one who called it the Marie Celeste instead of the Mary Celeste, and added all this stuff in there about how, like, oh, the log was kept updated up to the hour right before they disappeared, and there was fresh food on the table, blah, blah, blah. When in reality, there was no food on the table, and the log had last been updated 9 days before it was found. This is one thing the script does get right, is that they say it was 10 days, 9 days, 10 days, what's one day? And they also mentioned in the script, they do the food laid out on the table thing in the script, but they say it was rotted because it had been a few days, which at least makes more sense than like the standard retelling. So yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, it's a common like mistake that people tell, but I could imagine a sailor in this circumstance getting the story completely wrong. And also it comes directly from the short story, where this is actually a little bit more accurate than the version in the short story, because Kazuo thinks about, this is kind of like the Mary Celeste, and then goes through the whole thing and gets a bunch of details wrong. So on one hand, it comes right from the story they're adapting, and I could believe like an uneducated sailor guy fucking it up. But on the other hand, it's like, do we have to keep spreading this story about the Mary Celeste when it's bullshit? But yeah, he incidentally gets most of the details wrong. And he says, maybe we should leave it, because what the sea wants, the sea will surely have, which is echoed in another scene later. It doesn't make sense. I'll talk about it. And Equinox is soon pulled free from the ice, and they get underway. Johan tells them that the North Star's engine should be able to hold up under the extra pressure, but someone still needs to stay aboard the yacht in case something goes wrong. And he tries to order Eric to do it, but he says, I'm not going over there. Arnie died over there. So he at least has some concern for Arnie, which is good, I guess. He suggests Lucas be the one, but Lucas is reluctant until Chris offers to accompany him. And that is also different, because in the short story, Kazuo, he goes over to the yacht by himself. And he voluntarily does it because it's his last voyage. It may be his last voyage for the fishing company, so he figures he's going to go home in style, which is why he does it. So Johan sends them over, telling them to take survival suits, which I don't think comes back up again, and keep the radio on set to channel 9. And so on deck, they find an abandoned chair with a drink next to it, and Lucas notes an antique glass bottle tied to the hammer of the ship's bell. They enter the inside of the yacht, finding a high-tech wheelhouse with a cigar sitting in an ashtray, a spectacular living space with an extensive entertainment section, and a dining room with rotted food on the tables. So there that comes up again. A trip to the kitchen leads to Chris informing Lucas that even with a power battery turned on, without the engines, they won't have the power for long and won't get hot water at all. It's a thing where like there's like a whole bank of batteries by the engines that power all the electric stuff, and the engines keep the batteries charged or something like that. And Johan turned on one of them. And so basically there's no heat, no hot water, and it's a whole plot point about the engine not working. The two then go exploring below decks, with Lucas getting jump scared by an ironing board falling out of a closet. Yeah, it's a dumb fake out jump scare, but I gotta give this script credit where it's due. It only does like 2 or 3 of those, and most of the horror scenes are not jump scare heavy at all. And they then check out the staterooms, with Lucas finding a massive king-size bed in the main one, which he immediately throws himself down on. Then he talked about, when they were talking about what they would do with their money, he says something to the effect, with their shares of the crab, he was like, I'm going to go to a hotel and get the biggest bed I can find, something like that. And they soon find themselves back on deck, with Lucas writing in his journal and Chris checking the tow lines and noticing Eric staring at her from the deck of the North Star. Back in the living space, Chris makes coffee and points out some pictures of the family. 2 parents, a son and a daughter to Lucas. And they get to talking about each other, with Lucas confirming he's from Natick, Massachusetts, remember that, while Chris mentions he's from Anchorage, Alaska. And he asks her about the deal with her and Eric, but she avoids going into detail, saying he worked on her dad's boat 2 years ago and wasn't invited back. And Lucas then asks about her buying the boat back, and she tells him that he died before he could pay it off. And she gets emotional and leaves to check the lines again. And later that night, Chris has fallen asleep on the couch in the living space, and Lucas goes down to the engine room and checks out the bilge to look for ice damage. It's mentioned that the remaining water down there smells awful. He then returns to the wheelhouse and tries twice to radio into the North Star, all while looking for duct tape, which he finds. Johan finally responds, with Lucas reports that there's still no damage, and notices that Johan's breathing sounds off. Lucas then goes to turn off the radio and notices a strange whispering. Strange? What am I, Elmer Fudd? Strange whispering under the background hum of the radio. He asks if anyone was there, but the whispering stops. Nice, creepy moment. And here we're getting what's probably my favorite scene in the whole thing. It's original to this, but this might be my favorite scene in the entire script. We then go to the North Star, and we see Johan struggling to hang up the mic before he reaches for a vodka bottle and takes a swig, which is revealing that he's very quickly fallen off the wagon. He steps out of the pilot house and hears yelling, which is coming from Jerry and Vic arguing at the far end of the boat, which is, it sounds like they're violently arguing too, which is very out of character for them. And so he just ignores this and enters the quarters, where he looks at the abandoned Scrabble game, changing Vic's tiles from I almost to I am lost. And he then heads to the ice room where he finds Eric sitting on a folding chair, moving, his head's like moving a bit as if he's been talking. And then Eric turns to face Johan, and we see that Arnie's body has been removed from the ice and propped up just opposite of Eric. And Johan and Eric continue to stare at each other until the scene fades to black. I probably did not do that scene any justice describing it like that, but it is really eerie, very well written. It would have been very cool if directed the right way. And it's original to this because in the short story, it's never addressed what happened to the crew of the fishing boat. So this is, it's a cool little idea to put in there. And it just adds this like creepy feeling to it, which I love. Lucas wakes up the next morning and is shocked when he comes up on deck. He wakes up Chris and shows her the North Star and the lines attaching it to the yacht are gone completely. Chris tries reaching Johan on the radio, but Lucas is convinced that they left them there, going as far to go over to the Equinox and untie the lines, but Chris won't believe that and suggests waiting for them to come back. Later, they're both on deck and Lucas is writing in his journal again. He gets defensive when Chris asks him what he's been writing in it, and she leaves and goes back to the wheelhouse. Something catches Lucas's eye in a nearby window. It looks in on a small bathroom, and whatever has his attention is on the floor behind the sink. Meanwhile, Chris is trying the radio again when she spots the captain's log in the wheelhouse. Lucas has to break down the bathroom door to get inside, finding a video camera behind the sink. And Chris reads through the log, which is full of mundane entries with the last dated June 23rd. Clear skies, family fishing, quiet. Now, this is another thing that's different because in the short story, it's just Kazuo on the yacht. And he figures out the backstory just by reading the log. So the whole videotape thing has been added into this, I guess, to make it a more visual form of exposition. And so back with Lucas, the camera has finished rewinding, and the video reveals that the camera belonged to the son, who tended to torment his sister, and we see the family boarding the yacht, the mother looking unhappy. Look, he teases and he kids her, but it is clear throughout the whole thing that he does actually care about her when the chips are down. I will point that out. Chris checks the food supplies in the kitchen, finding the freezer to be half empty. Lucas continues watching the video, having fast-forwarded quite a bit, not noticing the shadow of someone lurking outside under the bathroom door. The video shows the son throwing bait at the daughter's hair before her fishing pole bends, and she thinks she's caught something. The camera then flashes a low battery indicator, and Lucas turns it off and leaves the room. And there's no one outside when he opens the door, despite the shadow still being there right before he leaves. That's another creepy moment. And Lucas walks around the yacht looking for Chris, and finding a quarter nailed it to the railing deck, which wasn't there before, and he eventually finds her in the engine room kneeling with her back to him. She doesn't respond when he talks to her, and her body seems to jerk strangely, so Lucas reaches out to touch her shoulder, which freaks her out, and she almost brains him with a wrench. And after that's all settled, Chris mentions that the log made no mention of engine trouble and didn't say much at all overall, which is strange considering the family of 4 and the crew are all missing. And I think in the short story, it was just the family. I don't think there was any mention of crew. She says she wants to try and fix the engine, and if she can't, they'll have to hope the North Star comes back for them. And heading back to the wheelhouse, Chris shows Lucas their worst-case scenario solution, a cylindrical object called an Emergency Positioning Indicating Beacon, or an EPIRB. If set off, it sends out an SOS and GPS signal that can be traced anywhere in the world, and a strobe light that can be seen for miles. But she wants to save it for only if the worst happens, though, as they'll lose the salvage rights if somebody other than the North Star picks them up. And she'll wait 24 hours for Johan to come get them before resorting to the beacon. I've seen quite a few, like, on the ocean horror or science fiction or, like, genre movies where salvage rights are, like, a huge part of the plot. Like, Virus has that, almost to an absurd degree. And it comes up in Ghost Ship as well. That shitty. This is better than Ghost Ship. It's better than Virus, too. Virus isn't terrible, but it's not that great. And while Chris gathers up the rotten food and chucks it into the bilge, wouldn't that just stink up the boat if you did that? I don't know what the protocol is for disposing of food debris on a boat. And so Lucas finds the kid's stateroom, which is shared between the brother and sister, and he goes looking around for something. And it's not clear what he's looking for at first. Like, it takes a few more pages for it to specify this, but he's looking for the camera's charger cord. And he then checks the sister's side, looking at the photos taped over the bed, and finds her diary with no peeking Simon written on the first page. Remember Simon. Chris walks by the open door and notices him intently looking at the pictures. Lucas joins Chris on deck later that night, and they both remark how unusually calm the sea is. Especially Chris, since she's been going out on for years and has never seen it like this. And I can confirm that. I've seen enough Deadliest Catch. Now, it's been years since I've sat down and watched that show, but I watched it for a while there, and the Bering Sea was always like churning and nasty, and the waves were always huge. Like it was never calm. They admired the Northern Lights, and Lucas remarks on the Inuit beliefs about them, and he says it's their equivalent of angels waving torches in the sky to guide the souls of the dead. And that, once again, is partly incorrect. From what I was reading, it's the souls of the dead themselves waving torches to light the way for the people who come after them or something like that. Once again, if there's any gaps in my research, please feel free to let me know. Which leads to Chris commending him for making sure Arnie was buried correctly. And he then apologizes for prying into the matter of her father's boat, and then tries to cheer her up by telling her a joke, which seems to do the job. And I actually wrote down the page numbers because it's not that funny, and I want to read it out. So there was this whorehouse outside of Las Vegas. Chris turns to him, bewildered. And one night, this really dignified, well-dressed guy shows up, tells the madam he wants a girl named Florida. The madam tells him that Florida is one of their most expensive ladies, but the guy insists. So Florida comes down, and yeah, she's pretty hot. She tells the guy she charges $1,000 a trick. Without missing a beat, the guy pulls out his wallet, peels out 10 $100 bills. So Florida takes him upstairs. Next night, the same thing happens. Classy guy shows up, asks for Florida. The madam tells him there's no special discount for 2 nights in a row, but the guy doesn't want one. He just whips out another $1,000, and then bam, he's upstairs again with Florida. Next night, the guy shows up again, say gets his last visit. No one can believe it. No one's ever seen Florida 3 nights in a row before. So she takes him upstairs, and when they're done, she starts asking him some questions. She finds out he's from Michigan and says, "Really? I have family in Michigan." The guy says, "I know. Your father died, and I'm your sister's attorney. She asked me to give you your $20,000 inheritance." Chris just stares at him. He grins. So the moral of the story is... only 3 things in life are certain: death, taxes, and being screwed by a lawyer. It's not a funny enough punchline for the amount of time it would take to tell that joke, not to mention the amount of time it would take to memorize it. But, maybe that's just me. Later that night, Chris has taken the main stateroom to sleep in, and Lucas has taken a smaller one. When he hears something and gets out of bed to go looking for it, he's hearing odd static coming from the radio, which seems to fade in and out. Lucas tries talking over the mic, but gets no answer before catching movement past the window out of the corner of his eye. He goes to the window and sees what looks like a dark figure standing at the bow. He steps out of the wheelhouse to get a better look, calling Chris's name in case it's her, but the figure is gone. Creepy. Lucas goes back in and shuts the door, turning around to find Chris right behind them, and Chris suggests that one of them should always be up just in case. The next day, Lucas is drinking wine in the living area, but Chris doesn't because she's like straight edge or something like that. And Chris is setting up a backgammon game, which Lucas doesn't know how to play. She goes looking for a pack of cards while Lucas tries to open a tight packet of cheese and tosses him a utility knife from her back pocket so he can open it. Turns out this is why Eric's face was cut up earlier. That time 2 years ago on her father's boat, the two of them drank too much and he may have raped her while she was passed out, and he tried to come on to her again a couple nights ago, so she had to drive him off. Yeah, that's kind of what you figured there was something going on there. But once again, Eric's not really a part of this script anymore, so it's kind of like a little weird in hindsight. And so Chris can't find any games other than backgammon, so Lucas gets an idea. He brings out the camera and hooks it up to the TV in the entertainment center to watch the video of the remaining battery power. There's a brief clip of the mother and father goofing around in the kitchen, and then it jumps ahead to the brother waking up at 3 a.m. and having to go look for his sister. He finds her on deck at the edge of the boat and tries to scare and tease her, but soon realizes that something is really wrong and tries to talk to her. She calls him Danny, he was Simon a few pages ago, and says they're not alone out there, clarifying she means on the boat, that there's someone else, and then the battery finally dies. Chris goes back to work on the engine using a gas lantern for light, and we see Lucas lying awake in the main stateroom still holding on to the daughter's diary. As he gets out of bed, we get a glimpse of a photograph taped above it, and as he opens the door, he reacts to a smell in the air. Lucas heads down to the engine room and talks to Chris. He tells her the girl's diary ends the same day as the captain's log and asks if she can smell what he smelled. They go up on deck and find the yacht is surrounded by a ring of dead, rotting fish, and that is never a good omen. So yeah, whatever is going on with this yacht ain't good. They start counting supplies again, and Chris finds a box of 4 dozen flares. And she tries to find a way to rationalize all the dead fish, but they don't quite add up. And Chris then finally sets up the EPIRB on deck and goes back to working on the engine, while Lucas mans the wheelhouse reading the girl's diary. And Chris, working with a space heater in the engine room, finally thinks to check the air intake tubes and finds a cork jammed in one of them. Lucas fires up the engine and the ship actually, comes on briefly. However, the space heater catches fire. We find out it was gas fumes in the airlines that got lit up, and Chris calls out to Lucas to shut it down. He does so, and he notices that the diary fell up into a mostly blank page with "I hid it" written in the white space. Nice creepy little use of foreshadowing. And rushes to the engine room with a fire extinguisher. He pulls Chris out of the smoke-filled room. Lucas catches a glimpse of a female figure that appears to be made out of air and given shape by the smoke, which I had the hard as hell time picturing in my head, which is then abruptly wiped out by the smoke falling in. He doesn't tell Chris what he saw, and soon enough they've got the engine started again in earnest and get the yacht underway, away from the dead. They then take turns in the shower, and Chris takes note of the picture Lucas taped over the bed in the stateroom of a little girl around 7. She turns around and runs right into him, saying she was looking for an extra towel. So we got a couple of scenes like it. We got the ironing board scene. We got scenes of them turning around and running into the person. But at least the first time that happened, there was the figure on the bow, and that kind of led to a good build-up for the jump. This time it's just awkward. In the living space, they eat caviar and drink champagne. Chris is now drinking because she figures why not celebrate. And Lucas digs through storage bins looking for the camera bag and the charger, assuming that's what the girl hid. He's curious as to what happened, and it might be recorded on the camera, but Chris just wants to get out of there and back on land. They continue to drink, and Chris takes a bottle with her to take a bath in a bathing suit for some reason. And Lucas follows her in there to talk to her, and she's okay with him staying, blah, blah, blah. And we get another kind of heartfelt confession scene. And I feel like this is a part of the script which kind of repeats itself a little bit, because we already had the scene of her talking about her father dying. And it's not like we learn enough new between the two scenes. We could have kind of mushed these into one and maybe had them bond over something else in the earlier scene. This is where I feel like it's starting to fall into the problem of we're adapting a short story that's only 30 pages long into a feature-length film, and this is a script that's 109 pages long, so it has to fill an hour and 49 minutes, and it just kind of stumbles under the fact that the short story, it has a nice little hook to it, but the actual events are kind of thin, so we have to pad it out to make it fit a movie, and I feel like it's padded out in the wrong places. I feel like other parts of this script could have been expanded a little more, especially towards the end, and some parts, especially in this middle section, could have been tamed down a bit, and maybe the opening a little bit as well with all the crab fishing stuff. But once again, it is a first draft, and it's the nature of the beast when you're adapting a short story. This is the kind of problem you could very easily run into. And so they talk more about the salvage, and Chris says she maybe doesn't want to buy back her father's boat, and reveals that she fell off the boat the last season she went with him, and he fell off himself during the rescue. And she tried to reach out to him, but he slipped and, fell away into the ocean. And so she blames herself for that. That's a good moment, and it pays off in dividends as the script goes on, which I like. And Lucas talks about how his grandfather was a sailor from Nova Scotia who relocated to Michigan, presumably because he wanted to get his family away from the water. And even though earlier Lucas said that he was from Natick, Massachusetts, so which is he from, Massachusetts or Michigan? Another one of those inconsistencies that cropped up, probably because it's a first draft that hasn't been revised yet. And he talks about how his grandfather inspired him to pursue law school and specialize in maritime law, but he got greedy for money and went into corporate instead, moving to LA. And one day, while stuck in rush hour traffic, he got a claustrophobic feeling and left everything behind to go look for something. And Chris asks him if he found it, and he looks at her and says maybe. So, okay, romantic entanglement. Now, the traffic thing, that's in the short story. Kazuo, his backstory in the short story is that he did 2 voyages on fishing boats, and the last one, it was just it was a voyage that didn't really go well. So he transferred and got a job on land with the fishing company. And one day he was driving the company car into Tokyo on a trip, and he just got caught in traffic. And that is what inspired him to go take this third and final voyage where he's the assistant engineer. And so, yeah, it's nice to see that, bits of the short story have made it into here in different forms. I think that's very cool. And so this leads to them tumbling into bed together, engaging in some strip maritime trivia, which is just cheesy. She's quizzing him on boat stuff, and she's not taking her clothes off. He has to answer trivia questions correctly to take his clothes off. So I'm not entirely sure what the point of the game is. It seems lopsided, if you know what I mean. But it all goes bad though, because when Lucas takes his shirt off, as the shirt comes off, his face is Eric's. And he's saying, what the sea wants, the sea will surely have, even though he wasn't the one who said that in the earlier scene. So that echo, that ironic echo, doesn't really make sense. It was either Vic or Jerry who said that. So putting it in the mouth of I get that it's Lucas is saying it as part of the trivia. And so when his face turns into Eric's, he would be saying the same thing. But it just feels like a weird callback to have a crew member say that who wasn't the one who said that before. And so she shoves him away and they end up not sleeping together. And Lucas, who isn't able to sleep anyways, heads up on deck and starts smoking, something which he never does, which he seems to realize before long, and stubs out the cigarette and throws the pack away. And that is a theme in the story where what's going on the yacht, which we'll get to, influences behavior and people start acting in ways that they wouldn't normally do when they don't even really notice it or realize they're doing it. He heads back inside to go to bed, but stops, noticing something is sitting on top of the backgammon board. It's the camera case, which wasn't there earlier. And Chris, also unable to sleep, gets up and crosses the hall to talk to Lucas, but he isn't there. He's still in the living space with the camera's AC adapter now plugged into the wall, and he starts to watch the rest of the video. It begins with the son filming out a window as the parents argue, talking about how the captain and crew have vanished. He then walks into the wheelhouse, where his sister is listening to the radio and turns it all the way up, and it's making the same sounds Lucas heard over the radio the other night. Chris enters the hall again and notices a figure standing on the stairs. Thinking it's Lucas, she starts to apologize for what happened and explain it, but she realizes it isn't him when it takes a step down as it's too tall. So yeah, this is where the horror really starts to ramp up, and the horror scenes are good, which is a good thing. I just feel like we're really far into this thing now. I feel like you could have paced out certain parts a little better, like I said. Like, we could have condensed some of the wandering around the ship fixing stuff, played this stuff out a little more, and played out the ultimate reveal a little more as well. And Lucas continues watching the video, and the son is now on the deck talking to the father as we see that the yacht is now surrounded by impenetrable fog. And the son says he can't find the mother and that he thinks his sister is hiding somewhere. And the father says it's her fault and looks at the camera, his face now different and crazed looking, and yells at the son to turn off the camera. Oh, so he's a Paranormal Activity character, won't stop screaming about turning off the camera. The screen goes black and Lucas goes to press fast forward before realizing the video is still running, with frightened breathing and metallic clanking filling the audio track. And so back below decks, Chris backs away from the figure as it stumbles toward her and reaches out its hand, and she runs away and hides in the bathroom trying to lock the door, but it's broken from when Lucas kicked it in earlier. She calls out to Lucas for help as she attempts to hold the door shut, but he's still watching the video as someone finally turns on the camera's headlamp. It shows the father in the engine room putting the camera down as he leans forward and tries to fix the engine. And he suddenly backs away from something while on his hands and knees and knocks over the camera, telling something to get away and asking why this is happening. And the image suddenly shifts to the bathroom where the camera is pointing towards the door, as the father says a Hail Mary, and we see the shadow of something in the crack under the door. And we go to that bathroom in the present day where Chris is now holding the door shut and she hears dragging footsteps approaching. This scene, the way it's cutting back and forth, and the way it's describing things, really good, actually. She sees the shadow under the door and pulls out her utility knife, yanks open the door and slashes at the figure, but it disappears immediately, leaving only Lucas with his hand badly cut. Chris tends to Lucas's wound, pouring vodka over it, and she asks why he didn't say anything when she called out to him, with Lucas insisting he was calling out for her. And she accuses him of fucking with her, but he tells her to calm down and that she's being paranoid. And Chris says there was someone right outside the door, and this sparks an idea in Lucas, who asks her to come with. And so he shows her the final scene of the video, with the father begging whatever is outside the bathroom door to leave him alone. The doorknob begins to shake as the camera zooms in on it, and the knob fills the frame, and the father starts to apologize, saying, "I'm sorry for opening it," as the video cuts to static and ends. That is creepy. Chris and Lucas begin to discuss the possibility that they're not alone on the Equinox, with Chris saying she's heard the noises of something moving around, and both of them admitting to catching glimpses of movement in the corners of their eyes that's gone when they look for it. Then they both hear a low hum coming from outside and rush onto the deck to see a plane flying far overhead. It's weird that they can see a plane, but they seem to be in this supernatural stretch of ocean where it's unusually calm, but they can still see planes that fly overhead. It would be creepier if they couldn't see anything at all. And so Chris fires off a flare, hoping the plane will notice it, and its light reveals that the North Star is nearby, floating in the Equinox's wake. Lucas cuts the engines and steers the Equinox around the North Star. They notice that the crab boat is smoke billowing from its exhaust. Chris wants to board it immediately and find out what happened, but Lucas talks her down, showing her that the crab boat isn't showing up on their radar. That sort of reveal in a horror movie always creeps me out, because it's basically just saying, normal physics, you can't trust your eyes, you can't trust your instrumentation. It just leaves you feeling very creeped out, because it's like, oh, the things you rely on are fucking up on you. And so Chris radios the North Star, but the only response is the echo of her voice from the crab boat's radio. Lucas, who has been using binoculars, gets Chris's attention and has her look at the pilot house of the North Star. There's a dark figure standing there and a bloody handprint and bloody smear on the wall inside. They go out on deck with xenon lights to get a better look at the pilot house and see that the figure has turned its back toward them. Lucas asks what to do, and Chris says they should get moving. I love that, just these figures lurking. That's very creepy, and if directed correctly, could be very cool to see in a movie. Chris goes to start up the engines, but they won't catch, and tells Lucas to grab the nearby fire axe and come with her. And they go over the entire yacht, turning on every light and checking every loom and large storage cabinets, looking for whatever is on board with them. They head into the engine room, and Lucas checks the bilge, gagging at the awful smell. Chris says it's algae, meaning the pump is broken. And before she can think up a solution, all of the lights go out at once. And I like what it does here, where it spends a moment just completely in darkness. I'm just imagining seeing that in a dark theater, just the screen goes black and you're just hearing sounds for a bit. I've seen movies do that, and it's an effect I like. After a moment in complete darkness, Chris switches on an emergency flashlight and checks the bank of batteries, discovering they have all died at once. And Chris tries to fix the engine while Lucas mans the wheelhouse, and they keep trying to start it, but nothing they do is working. Lucas walks to the door and looks out at the North Star, noticing there is now a figure standing at the bow of the crab boat, as close as it can get to the Equinox, staring at him. As Chris's flashlight dies in the engine room, Lucas walks to the rail and stares at the figure. He fires a flare, but the figure's hooded parka still obscures its face. He then notices that the two vessels are surrounded by dense fog, just like in the video. This is reminding me of in Dear Esther. There's like these weird shadow things that you can catch glimpses of throughout the game, and you can't really get too close to them. You can never make out any real features on them, but they're there. Once you figure out they're there, it's beyond creepy. Chris, using a lit match, has made her way to a storage cabinet and is looking for batteries for the flashlight. Two small figures are standing in the doorway of the cabin behind her, but when she senses them and turns around, they're gone. Chris enters the cabin, which turns out to be the children's stateroom. She walks towards the daughter's bed, hidden by a taffeta curtain. She raises the match and sees a figure sitting on the bed behind the curtain, and as she reaches for it, the match goes out. As she fumbles for another match in the dark, the girl's voice is heard saying, "I'm lost. I'm so lost." Chris gets a new match lit, finding the curtain has been drawn back and Lucas's journal is on the pillow. So this part is implying that the figures are ghosts of the victims of this, whatever this curse is that's going on. It's not explored enough to really mean anything. It's just sort of there, and why would two of them be helping when others are attacking? And we find out it's not exactly what's going on later. Once again, probably a first draft issue. And so Lucas is still on deck when he hears the radio crackle in the wheelhouse. He heads back inside. He glances at the deck of the North Star where the figure is still standing, meaning it can't be the one using the radio. And Lucas turns up the radio's volume and speaks into the microphone, realizing that the voice on the other end is his own, repeating what he just said in an eager whisper, which just bone-chilling, man. Whew, especially the way it's described in the script. I can't fully do it justice. He drops the mic, and the voice says something he didn't. "I'm so lost, so alone." Freaks out and runs down the stairs into the living area, and I don't blame him. And Lucas finds food packages and bottles scattered around in the living area and just catches a glimpse as something darts away down the hall. He follows it, calling for Chris, and sees the door to the main stateroom close in front of him. And it turns out it is actually Chris he's following this time, and she's locked herself in the room with a chair jammed under the knob. She says she'll kill him if he tries to come inside. Lucas then notices his journal on the floor nearby and picks it up, and Chris asks him who the girl in the photo is, and he reveals that she's his daughter, Alice. And here we get some extended backstory, which I'm going to have to talk about and kind of elaborate on a little bit, because I have certain things I thought about this when I first read it that I don't think are correct anymore. And he and his ex Tara, they had Alice while they were still in college. They didn't have the strongest relationship, but they tried to make it work. Lucas taking a job at a big firm, And he was working all the time trying to establish himself as a lawyer, hoping that, that if he could establish himself and get a good living, then they could repair their relationship and they could maybe become strong. But one day he came home and found Tara and Alice gone and no note or anything left behind. So that's kidnapping, technically, Tara. And he went up on the roof of their apartment building and nearly jumped off. And he says he ended up on the crab boat trying to find out if he still wanted to live. So we just unfortunately contradicted character backstory from the short story. Now, they don't necessarily contradict, but it's weird that we get two different versions of backstory for him. Also, Alice had kept a diary of her own, filled with things she wanted to show him that he was never around for, and that's why he keeps the journal. Now, the first time I read this as him saying that the girl on the yacht was Alice, and that something his wife had hooked up with this guy, and then they had a son together. Reading it this time, I think I was mistaken and I was assuming things that weren't there. And that was one of my major criticisms of it, of what is this big fucking coincidence? Now, maybe it is there and I missed it because I missed it, that maybe I skimmed over it this time around, but I don't think it's there. That was an unfair criticism of this I had in the past. That's what I'm going with now. But yeah, I just felt a need to point that out, that I had made that mistake. And so Chris, moved by the story, slides something under the door. It's a folded up photo of Alice with her face scratched out with a spiral of ink. Someone's been watching The American Ring. And Lucas asks her why she did this, and she tells him she didn't, he did, and to look at the journal. So he opens it up and discovers that all the pages have been scratched out and filled with dark spirals from spine to margin. So he's got the Uzumaki curse going on. And so Chris tells him that whatever happened to the yacht is now happening to him and that he should stay away from it. So yeah, interesting twist. A few more coming. And we get an exterior shot of the equinox showing us that the ring of fog has gotten closer to both it and the North Star, and the wind has picked up, making the bell chime. The interior of the yacht is so cold it's covered in frost now, and we see Lucas staring blankly into a burner frame on the stove. Flame, and Chris huddling up in blankets to stay warm. The burner goes out, and when he tries to start the others, Lucas slips and falls to the floor, catching sight of the cork Chris pulled out of the engine intake. He starts thinking, examining it, and then looks at the window at the bottle tied to the bell, and he has like a realization. And Lucas steps out onto the deck, which is now completely covered in fog, and tries to cork with the bottle, and it turns out to be a perfect fit. So after a quick scene of Chris turning on her flashlight inside the stateroom, we go back to Lucas as he checks the video again, rewinding to the point where the family boards the ship, where he notices that the bell doesn't have the bottle attached to it. He then fast forwards to the part where the daughter caught something with her pole and watches it instead of skipping past as she finds the bottle is caught on the hook. She peers through the glass saying she sees something inside it. And Chris, after nearly nodding off, reaches into her bag and pulls out a water bottle, surprised to find it's frozen solid. She reaches in for another one and feels something that shocks her. Chris shines the flashlight on the bag and pulls out the towing cables and bridle that connected the two boats. And the ropes have been neatly cut. She looks at the knife and realizes that she's been affected too, which is a good twist because I don't think that's in the short story. I think the ropes are just gone the next morning and it's never explained. The idea that the curse or whatever it is kind of the supernatural power is influencing their actions and making them do stuff. It's in keeping with the short story, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it's a new interesting idea to put in there. And for someone who's coming to this cold who doesn't know the short story, they're thinking, maybe Lucas is being affected by this thing. And they get the twist that she is too, in the theater. And she calls for Lucas and throws open the door, giving us just a glimpse of the figure standing outside before it cuts away. And Lucas is still watching the video in the living space, not noticing two small figures shaped like the son and daughter sitting behind him on the couch. And so I think that's the last time that concept is even addressed. So it's not something, once again, it's not an idea that's the video shows the daughter prying open the bottle, and then, even though it was the father who said in the video earlier he's sorry he opened it, and finding a colorful metallic-like sheen to it and an ugly bulge in the middle that makes it look like an eye. He then realizes that I hid it referred to that and not the camera bag. That is the big thing in the short story, is there's a shell that looks like an eye, and it's not explained why. It's just evil, and it causes bad shit to happen. And so what happens is that instead of the videotape in the short story, he reads the log, and it's like he reads through it on his first night there. And he doesn't, and the whole thing with the shell is in the log, but he just kind of glances over it and doesn't think anything of it. But when shit starts going bad, he goes back and looks at the log and goes, oh, this must be what's going on. And so he goes to look for it because he knows the daughter hid it. he goes into her room on the ship and just starts turning it over, looking for it, and then it's like he blanks out and comes back to himself, and he has just violently torn the place apart. So that's where it's implying that the shell is somehow influencing his behavior, which is, it's one of those things that's barely touched on, and it's expanded on here. I maybe would have expanded on it in a different way than what this does, but it's not a bad idea necessarily. It's not badly written. And so he tears open every storage case and living space looking for it, every kitchen cabinet, and even under the couch cushions. And Lucas then runs below decks and sees the main stateroom's door is open. He calls out to Chris, telling her it's not the ship, but something the daughter found that's causing this. And he finds the cabin empty and the cut tow lines, and he realizes what Chris did too, that she's being influenced. And Lucas then sees Chris's footprints in the frost and begins to follow them, grabbing an EPIRB, which they turned it off earlier because they had got the engine started. So he turns it on and he's using the strobe as a flashlight, which is smart, actually. I like that. And they head to the engine room. They lead him to the engine room where he hears a voice say, "No, I can't hold on," coming from inside the build. So he opens the door and peeks inside, seeing Chris standing in the far corner, slumped over and facing away from him. Lucas tries to talk to her, but she keeps mumbling about having to hold on, etc. Chris eventually faces him, saying, "I can't leave him." He says there's nobody else here. But Chris looks back over her shoulder. Lucas looks as well, seeing a body floating face down in the water. It's presumably meant to be her father. So it's manifesting her dead father, basically, to fuck with her. And Lucas manages to lead Chris out of the bilge, but she keeps her eyes on the body as it raises its head from the water, its shadowy face turning to look at Lucas as they leave. Ooh, that's a great image. Lucas gets her out into the hallway, and Chris seems to snap out of it. He tells her to need to leave the ship as soon as possible, and she says that the life raft is located in the wheelhouse. So they find the raft and the orange sack full of emergency supplies, and she says that will only last a week. We need to gather more. Chris goes to the kitchen to find that and steps on Arnie's necklace, breaking the small bottle, which that was a whole lot of build up for nothing. And so I guess, the necklace just being on the floor means that Lucas dropped it, and so that means he's being taken over or something like that. But it's not a concrete enough connection for me to really go, that was necessary. We needed that as part of the plot. Chris emerges back on deck, finding the octagonal raft now inflated, but Lucas is nowhere to be seen in all that fog. And she puts down the garbage bag full of supplies and leans over to pick up the orange sack, revealing a figure wielding an axe in the fog behind her. That is almost note for note the same as a scene from Argento's Tenebrae. Nice little nod. I like it. Chris, she's putting the emergency supplies bag into the raft, and she turns just in time for the axe to miss her, and she trips over the raft. The figure saying, "You took her away from me," gets closer, revealing it to be Lucas. And so basically it's driving Lucas crazy, making him think he's attacking his ex. Chris is backed up against a railing and has nowhere to run to, but is saved when the North Star slams into the Equinox, knocking Lucas off his feet. And as he struggles to get back to his feet, Chris grabs the raft with the orange sack inside and tries to push it over the railing, and Lucas is getting back up with the axe in hand. She shoves with all her strength, gets it into the water, and she dodges just in time, and the axe hits the rail. She turns and grabs it. She's struggling with Lucas for control of the weapon. Chris tries to reason with him, but it doesn't work, and when she notices that the North Star drifting towards them again, she lets go of the axe, letting the impact knock her over the rail. And the freezing temperatures in the water shock Chris into stillness, and Lucas, knocked off his feet by the collision, slides through a ladderway and into the water as well. Chris manages to come back to her senses and swims for the raft, managing to pull herself in with the line. And Lucas calls out to her, and she paddles the raft over to him, but she's too late, and he sinks beneath the sea and dies. So that's a nice little tragic callback to what happened to her father. And it dissolves to dawn, and Chris is paddling the raft and emerges from the fog into the day, only stopping briefly to look back behind her as she paddles towards the sun. This is another criticism I have with the script. So I feel like the climax here happens way too quickly. Like, finally get the reveal of the shell, which as a reader of the short story, I'd been waiting for the entire thing. And then almost immediately go into the ending where they're like, we have to get off this boat. And then immediately goes into him going axe crazy and attacking her. And then that almost immediately resolves itself with the North Star slamming into them. And like, it just happens too quickly. Like, I feel like this last stretch of the script, like this 15 pages, could have been a little bit more of the script with some of the other stuff tamed back. That's my main thing. I feel like this this climax where like the thing finally comes together. It comes together and then the script fucking ends. But once again, first draft problems, and you're adapting a 30-page short story, you're going to run into problems. And so it then fades to black and fades back in on a sloop in the Sea of Cortez, which if you don't know, that's down by Mexico. And it's manned by a young boy and his father who is busy playing a PSP game. Wow, really showing your age there, script. While his son reads Swiss Family Robinson. And the boy notices something out on the sea and uses a pair of binoculars to get a better look. He gets his dad's attention and hands him the binoculars as well. We then show the boy using a long boat hook to pull something in, which looks to be the life raft. The boy notices there seems to be something or someone underneath a blanket. And while his dad goes to call it in, the boy pulls it back. And you're thinking there's going to be a body, but it's just the orange supply sack tipped over. And the boy dumps the supplies and is puzzled by the fact that the food is uneaten and the water bottles are unopened. And the dad, telling him not to touch anything, asks for the name of the ship, and the boy reads off the Equinox, which is printed on the side. A colorful reflection is then cast on the boy's face, and he digs through the supplies and finds the shell, which seems to enamor him. As the boy tells the dad that he's found something, it fades to black and ends. So no happy ending for Chris, sadly. Basically, the idea is that the daughter hid the shell with the emergency supplies, and no one thought to look there. And that twist is straight from the short story. What happens there is that Kazuo has that moment where he goes crazy, tearing the room apart, comes back to himself, and he goes, shit, I'm getting in the life raft, I'm getting off this boat, and he takes the emergency supplies. And then the short story is like, what he didn't know was down. Let me actually see if I can find the passage. He never did notice. Kazuo never did find out where the daughter had hidden the small glass bottle. Okay, yeah, so in the short story, it never leaves the bottle. She tucked it away in the supply sack, tossed onto the lifeboat, and now sat snugly between the rubber bottom and the side tube. In the silver sack, among packs of water and cans of food, the eye kept watch. And that's how the short story ends. So this kind of expands on it and does it in a way that would probably be easier to shoot, because I don't know how you do like a subjective camera going into a supply sack and finding like a seashell at the bottom. That would be a strange... I'm sure Guillermo del Toro could figure out how to shoot something like that, because he's a fucking master when it comes to model work. But yeah, that's a good way to maintain the dark ending of the story, but to kind of expand it a little bit. Overall, I think the script is pretty decent. It's got some good horror scenes, some good atmosphere. The characters are pretty decent for the most part. Chris and Lucas are likable leads. The only really unlikable, annoying guy is Eric, and even he's not in it for terribly, terribly long. I just think it has like some first draft problems. Like it could, the second act of this thing could do with just a little bit of compression. Like maybe take some of those conversation scenes, combine them into one, remove like multiple scenes of them going up and down deck, digging through storage bins and all that. And maybe, expand the climax a little bit, have them discover the shell part of the video a little bit earlier and not really think of anything of it until later. And maybe have like the climax on deck, because it just kind of turns into like really, really short dime store Shining conclusion. At the end of this, like it just kind of turns into The Shining, only done in about 5 pages, where he picks up the axe and goes crazy and starts chasing her. Yeah, just give the climax a little bit more time to breathe, I think is the problem. Address the shell a little bit earlier so it has this looming presence over the story. And then let that climax breathe. I think this could actually work. Now, in terms of adaptation, there is a part of me that would have preferred a version of this where it's just the one-man show with Lucas alone on the yacht, like Kazuo was in the short story. But that's something that would be even harder to expand the story into a feature-length film if you did that. In this, having Chris on board allows for some character development and some interactions and some dialogue, which would be difficult, which would be almost impossible, would be a little bit more difficult to do if you were doing it with him by himself. So yeah, overall I can say this is pretty good for a first draft. It could be better, but like that's what first drafts are for, so you can write a second or a third draft and make it better. And I don't know why this didn't happen. I can think of a few different things. One, it was apparently at Dimension, and 2005 is when the Weinsteins split with Disney and left Miramax behind, and a whole bunch of their projects, like at Dimension, got fucked up because of that. Like Halloween Asylum ended up getting canceled because, it got caught up in that mess. And the other thing I'm thinking of is, did they maybe not realize that German production that became Open Water 2 was loosely basing itself on the short story? And did they go, oh shit, the rights got sniped from us or something? Did the wind get taken? Did our hype get stolen by Open Water 2? Did they cancel because of that? I don't know. But what's interesting is that the project has kind of come around, and there's a version of it in development again, because I think it was either earlier this year or sometime last year it was announced that Darren Aronofsky is supposed to be adapting it. He's supposed to be writing it and directing it, and Jared Leto is supposed to be starring in it. And I don't know about Leto, but maybe with Aronofsky backing him up, the movie won't be too bad. But I can't wait. As decent as this script is, I can't help but think the Aronofsky version will be even better, because Black Swan, it's labeled psychological thriller, but that's practically a horror movie, and it's really good. And Aronofsky is just one of those guys who, even in his lesser films, still manages to be really interesting. So I would love to see what he does with that. Just don't let Jared Leto go like, I have to float around in the freezing cold water to know what it's like, and then accidentally die during production or some shit like that. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing if he does that. Hopefully it will be his next project after The Whale, because it just really intrigues me, this idea of him doing Adrift. So I look forward to that happening if it does. And that's this episode, really. It's a decent little straightforward horror script with a different enough premise. It's not relying on ghosts. It's not relying on any kind of known monster. And it's not reliant on jump scare. So it's a good first draft. It just needs work. And I would say that's where I'm going to leave it off. Could use a little sanding down of the rough edges, but I think it had potential and I would have liked to have seen it. But once again, whatever Aronofsky does with it, I'm sure will be better. No offense to Steven Susko, but I mean, it's Darren Aronofsky. Come on. But yeah, that should be it, guys. Hope you enjoyed the episode. And until next time, bye.